The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I stared at my computer screen, the cursor blinking mockingly at the end of an unfinished sentence. It was 5:47 p.m. on a Thursday, and the office had that particular emptiness that comes when most people have already fled to their evening lives. The marketing department at Henderson & Associates was never exactly bustling, but by this hour, it usually resembled a ghost town. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Marcus Thompson, and at 26, I was still trying to figure out if this job was a stepping stone or a trap. Fresh out of college with a communications degree that felt increasingly worthless with each passing day, I'd landed this position 8 months ago through a combination of desperation and what my mom generously called persistence. The pay was decent enough to cover my studio apartment in Queens and my student loans, with just enough left over for the occasional night out that reminded me I was supposed to be young. The job itself wasn't terrible. I wrote copy for insurance brochures, updated social media accounts that nobody seemed to follow, and occasionally got to work on campaigns that might actually reach real people. But there was something about the atmosphere at Henderson & Associates that felt suffocating. Maybe it was the beige walls, or the way conversations died when certain people walked into a room, or the fact that half the employees looked like they'd given up on life somewhere around the Clinton administration. Then there was Victoria Chen. Victoria was the senior marketing director, my direct supervisor, and possibly the most intimidating person I'd ever worked for. At 52, she carried herself with the kind of confidence that came from 2 decades of climbing corporate ladders in heels that could probably be classified as weapons. Her black hair was always pulled back in a perfect bun, her suits were impeccable, and she had a way of looking at you that made you feel like she could see straight through whatever excuse you were about to give. She'd been with the company for 12 years, having arrived from some high-powered position at a Manhattan firm under circumstances nobody talked about. There were rumors, of course. Office gossip suggested everything from a messy divorce to a corporate scandal, but Victoria herself never offered any personal information. She was professional to the point of being almost robotic, brilliant at her job, and completely unapproachable. In the 8 months I'd been working under her, our interactions had been limited to project briefings, deadline discussions, and the occasional correction delivered in her crisp, no-nonsense tone. She never raised her voice, never lost her composure, but somehow managed to make you feel about 2 inches tall when you'd messed something up. I respected her immensely and was absolutely terrified of her in equal measure. The office dynamics were complicated. Victoria reported directly to James Henderson, the company founder's son, who was about as sharp as a bowling ball and twice as dense. Henderson had inherited the business and treated it like his personal playground, making decisions based on golf course conversations and magazine articles he'd half read. The fact that the company was still profitable was entirely due to people like Victoria, who quietly fixed his mistakes and ran things behind the scenes. But you could see the toll it was taking on her. Over the months I'd been there, I'd noticed the way her jaw tightened during meetings when Henderson would override her recommendations. I'd seen her stay late, cleaning up messes that could have been avoided if anyone had listened to her in the first place. And lately, there was something else, a weariness that went beyond normal work stress. That Thursday evening, I was putting the finishing touches on a campaign proposal that was due the next morning. It was for a new life insurance product, and I'd been struggling to find the right angle. How do you make people excited about their own mortality? I'd gone through a dozen different approaches, from fear-based messaging to family-focused emotional appeals, but nothing felt right. I was so absorbed in trying to craft a headline that didn't sound like a threat when I heard the soft click of heels on the polished floor. Victoria appeared at the entrance to my cubicle, and I immediately straightened up, minimizing the tab where I'd been browsing job listings during my last break. "Marcus," she said, her voice carrying that familiar tone of controlled efficiency. "I need you to stay late tonight. We have a situation with the Brennan account." The Brennan account was our biggest client, a regional restaurant chain that brought in about 30% of our revenue. They were also notoriously difficult, constantly changing their minds about campaigns and demanding revisions that made no sense. Working on their account was like being trapped in a creative purgatory where good ideas went to die. "Of course," I replied, though my heart sank a little. I'd been planning to meet my college roommate David for drinks, our first hangout in weeks. But you don't say no to Victoria Chen, especially not when she's using that particular tone. Good. I'll need you to review all the Q3 materials and cross-reference them with the new brand guidelines they sent over this afternoon. They've decided to change their entire visual identity 3 weeks before launch. I felt my eyebrows rise involuntarily. 3 weeks before launch? Yes. Apparently the CEO's daughter just graduated from art school and has some fresh insights about their brand direction. The way Victoria said fresh insights made it clear what she thought about the CEO's daughter's artistic education. Right. How extensive are the changes? Complete color palette revision, new logo, different typography, and they want to shift the messaging from family dining to culinary adventure. Everything we've done for the past 4 months needs to be redone. I stared at her, waiting for some indication that she was joking. When none came, I felt a familiar knot forming in my stomach. This wasn't just a late night. This was going to be a complete overhaul that would probably take weeks to implement. Properly. I'll get started on the review right away, I said, already mentally canceling my evening plans. Victoria nodded and turned to leave, then paused. Marcus? Yes? Order dinner, whatever you want. Company card. She placed a corporate credit card on my desk. We're going to be here for a while. After she left, I sat staring at the credit card for a moment. In 8 months, Victoria had never offered to buy me so much as a coffee. The gesture was small, but it felt significant somehow, like a crack in the professional armor she always wore. I pulled up the Brennan account files and began diving into the materials. The original campaign had actually been quite good. Warm, family-oriented messaging with photography that made their restaurants look like places where generations gathered to create memories. The new direction they wanted was completely different, aggressive and trendy in a way that felt forced for a chain that primarily served pot roast and meatloaf. As I worked, I became aware of Victoria moving around the office. Usually, when she stayed late, she disappeared into her corner office and I wouldn't see her again until the next morning. But tonight, she seemed restless. I caught glimpses of her walking past my cubicle, sometimes stopping at the coffee machine, sometimes just pacing. Around 7:30, I decided to take a break and ordered Thai food from a place that delivered it to the office. I got enough for 2 people, figuring Victoria might be hungry too. When the food arrived, I knocked on her office door. "Come in," she called. Victoria's office was exactly what you'd expect. Minimalist, organized, with a few carefully chosen pieces of art on the walls. Her desk was massive and spotless except for her computer, a legal pad covered in her precise handwriting and a framed photo turned away from where visitors would sit. "I ordered dinner," I said, holding up the bag. "Got some extra if you're interested." She looked up from her computer, and for a moment, her mask slipped. I saw surprise, then something that might have been gratitude. "That's very thoughtful. I haven't eaten since lunch." We set up the food on the small conference table in her office. As we ate, Victoria seemed different somehow. The rigid posture was still there, but there was something more relaxed about her manner. Maybe it was just the informal setting, or maybe she was as tired as I was starting to feel. "The Brennan changes are insane," I said, testing the waters. "For a more casual conversation. That's one word for it." Victoria took a bite of pad thai. "I've been working with restaurants for 15 years. This is the kind of decision that kills brands." "Have you told them that?" "I've tried. But when the CEO's daughter has a degree from Parsons and 3 months of internship experience, my 15 years in the industry suddenly don't count for much." There was a bitterness in her voice that I'd never heard before. Victoria always seemed so in control, so unaffected by the politics and stupidity that plagued most workplaces. Hearing her actually express frustration was like discovering that the statue you'd been admiring was actually human. "Why do you stay?" The question slipped out before I could stop myself. Victoria set down her fork and looked at me with that analytical gaze that usually made me want to disappear under my desk. But this time, instead of feeling like I was being dissected, it felt like she was actually considering the question. "That's a good question," she said finally. "I ask myself that fairly regularly." We ate in silence for a few minutes. The office building had settled into its after-hours quiet. The kind of profound stillness that only comes when you're one of the few people left in a place designed for hundreds. Outside Victoria's window, I could see the lights of other office Buildings, probably filled with other people working late on other meaningless projects. I used to work at Morrison & Klein in Manhattan, Victoria said suddenly. Big agency, Fortune 500 clients, the whole corporate dream. I was on track to make a partner. I nodded, not wanting to interrupt what felt like a rare moment of openness. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I was married then. 15 years to a man who was also climbing the corporate ladder, just in a different building. We had this beautiful apartment on the Upper West Side. 2 cars, a house in the Hamptons for weekends. From the outside, we looked like we had everything figured out. She paused, staring out the window at the darkening sky. But we never saw each other. He was traveling constantly for his consulting firm, and I was pulling 60-hour weeks trying to prove I belonged, in a room full of men who thought I was just there to fill a diversity quota. We scheduled our conversations like business meetings. We had to book time to have dinner together. I found myself leaning forward, drawn into her story despite myself. The divorce was messy, not just emotionally, but professionally. When you work in the same industry in the same city, word gets around. Suddenly, I was difficult to work with and going through a hard time. My billable hours were scrutinized. My recommendations were questioned. I went from being a rising star to being a liability. "That's awful," I said, and meant it. The final straw was when they passed me over for a partner and gave it to someone with half my experience and a fraction of my clients' results. The reason they gave was that I wasn't a cultural fit. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. 15 years of my life, and I wasn't a cultural fit. Victoria stood up and walked to the window, her silhouette framed against the city lights. So I left. I took the first decent offer that came along, which happened to be here. It was supposed to be temporary, just until I figured out my next move. That was 12 years ago. I didn't know what to say. This was more personal information than Victoria had shared in the entire time I'd known her, and I felt honored and terrified in equal measure. The woman I'd thought of as an untouchable corporate machine was revealing herself to be someone who'd been kicked around by the same system I was struggling to navigate. "Why haven't you moved on?" I asked gently. She turned back to face me, and in the soft light from her desk lamp, she looked older than her 52 years. Not physically. Victoria was still strikingly attractive, with the kind of bone structure that aged gracefully. But there was a weariness in her eyes that spoke of battles fought and dreams deferred. "Honestly, I got comfortable. Not happy, but comfortable. The pay is good, the work is adequate. And after what happened in Manhattan, I wasn't sure I had the energy to fight that fight again somewhere else." She sat back down across from me, and for a moment, we just looked at each other. It was the first time I'd ever felt like I was seeing the real Victoria Chen, not the carefully constructed professional persona she wore like armor. "But lately," she continued, "I've been wondering if comfortable is enough. If this is what I want the rest of my career to look like." The conversation was interrupted by my phone buzzing with a text from David, asking if I was still coming out. I glanced at it and quickly typed back that I was stuck at work. "Your girlfriend?" Victoria asked, noticing my phone. "Just a friend wondering where I am. We were supposed to get drinks tonight. I'm sorry. I know staying late isn't exactly how you plan to spend your evening." "It's okay. Honestly, most of my evenings aren't that exciting anyway." Victoria smiled at that, the first genuine smile I'd ever seen from her. It transformed her face completely, erasing years of professional sternness and revealing the person she might have been in a different life. "Well, we should probably get back to it," she said, though she made no move to leave the table. "These Brennan revisions won't finish themselves." We returned to our respective workstations, but something had shifted. The atmosphere felt different, less formal, as if the conversation in her office had created a small bubble of honesty in our usual professional distance. As I worked through the campaign materials, making notes about what would need to be changed, I found myself thinking about Victoria's story. Here was someone who'd achieved everything I thought I wanted: success, respect, financial security, and she was just as lost as I was. Maybe more so. Around 9 p.m., I heard her heels clicking across the floor again. This time she appeared at my cubicle with 2 cups of coffee from the fancy machine in the break room. "Thought you might need this," she said, setting 1 cup on my desk. "Thanks." I took a sip. It was perfect. Exactly the right amount of cream, exactly how I liked it. I was surprised she'd noticed. "How's the review coming?" "Slow but steady. I've got about half the materials cataloged. The scope of changes is even bigger than I thought." Victoria leaned against the edge of my desk, a casualness that would have been unthinkable 12 hours earlier. "Marcus, can I ask you something?" "Sure." "What? Do you want, long term? Is this just a paycheck for you, or do you actually want to build a career in marketing?" The question caught me off guard. Not because it was inappropriate, but because it was exactly the question I'd been avoiding asking myself. "I don't know," I admitted. "I thought I did when I started here, but lately, I feel like I'm just going through the motions, like I'm waiting for my real life to start, but I don't know what the signal is supposed to be." Victoria nodded as if this made perfect sense. "I felt that way when I was your age. Like everyone else had received some manual for how to be an adult, and I was just making it up as I went along. Did it get easier? In some ways. You get better at pretending you know what you're doing, but the fundamental questions don't really go away. They just get more complicated." We worked in companionable silence for the next hour, occasionally sharing observations about the Brennan materials, or making disparaging comments about the CEO's daughter's artistic vision. It was the most natural I'd ever felt at work, and definitely the most human Victoria had ever seemed. Around 10:30, I noticed that Victoria had stopped typing. When I looked over, she was staring at her computer screen, but her eyes weren't moving. She looked lost in thought. Or maybe just lost. "You okay?" I asked. She startled slightly, as if she'd forgotten I was there. "Yes, just thinking about something." There was a long pause, and I thought the conversation was over. Then, almost so quietly I had to strain to hear her, she said something that would change everything between us. "Marcus, I need to tell you something, and I need you to know that I'm not saying this because you work for me, or because I'm your boss, or because of any professional dynamic between us." I felt my heart rate pick up. There was something in her voice, a vulnerability that was both intimate and terrifying. "I'm 52 years old," she continued, still staring at her screen. "And I'm tired of being alone every night." The words hung in the air between us like smoke, impossible to take back once spoken. Victoria's confession, "I'm 52 years old and I'm tired of being alone every night," seemed to echo in the empty office space, bouncing off the beige walls and fluorescent lights that suddenly felt too bright, too harsh for such a raw moment. Sat frozen at my desk, my fingers still poised over the keyboard where I'd been typing notes about color palette changes and logo specifications. The mundane work that had occupied my attention moments before now seemed absurdly trivial compared to what had just happened. My mind raced through a dozen different responses, none of them adequate for the magnitude of what Victoria had just shared. She wasn't looking at me. Her eyes remained fixed on her computer screen, but I could see her reflection in the dark window behind her monitor. Her face was a careful mask of composure, but there was something fragile around the edges, as if she was bracing herself for my reaction. "Victoria," I started, then stopped. What was the appropriate response here? This was my boss, a woman who commanded respect throughout the company, someone who had never shown even the slightest crack in her professional armor until tonight, and now she was sitting 20 feet away from me, having just admitted to a loneliness so profound that it compelled her to confess it to her subordinate during a late-night work session. "I shouldn't have said that," she said quickly, still not meeting my eyes. "That was inappropriate. Let's just focus on the Brennan materials." But something about the way she said it, the slight tremor in her voice, the speed with which she tried to retract the moment, made it clear that this wasn't something she could simply take back. The professional barrier between us had already been crossed, and pretending otherwise would only make things more awkward. "No," I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. "Don't do that. Don't pretend you didn't say it." Victoria finally looked at me, her dark eyes reflecting a mixture of surprise and something that might have been relief. We stared at each other across the empty office space, the silence stretching between us like a bridge neither of us was sure we should cross. I don't know why I said that, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I've never… This isn't like me, Marcus. I don't share personal information. I don't let people see… See what? She was quiet for a long moment, and I thought she might retreat back into her professional shell. But then she stood up from her desk and walked over to where I was sitting. Not close enough to be inappropriate, but close enough that I could see the exhaustion in her face, the weight of whatever she'd been carrying alone. See that I'm human, I suppose. See that the woman who has everything figured out actually doesn't have anything figured out at all. The vulnerability in her admission hit me like a physical force. Here was Victoria Chen, the woman who terrified junior executives and commanded six-figure budgets, telling me that she felt as lost as I did. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent months looking up to her as someone who had mastered the game of professional life, only to discover that she felt like she was losing it. Can I ask you something? I said. She nodded. When you said you're tired of being alone every night, what did you mean? Victoria walked to the window and looked out at the city. From her office, you could see the lights of Manhattan in the distance, millions of people living their lives in those glowing windows. But somehow, the view made the world seem even more vast and isolating. I mean exactly what I said. I go home every night to an empty apartment. I eat dinner alone, watch television alone, and go to bed alone. Weekends are the worst. 2 days of silence broken only by whatever mindless show I'm streaming or the occasional call from my sister in California who feels obligated to check on me. She paused, her breath fogging the window slightly. Do you know what it's like to realize that you could disappear for a week and the only people who would notice are your assistant and the doorman in your building? And even they would only notice because it would affect their routines? I wanted to say something comforting, but the truth was, I could relate more than she probably expected. My own social life wasn't exactly thriving. Between work, exhaustion, and the general difficulty of making meaningful connections in your 20s, I spent plenty of evenings alone in my studio apartment, wondering if this was what adult life was supposed to feel like. I know it's not the same, I said carefully. But I understand feeling isolated. Sometimes I'd go days without having a real conversation with anyone. Victoria turned from the window to look at me, and something in her expression had shifted. The careful professional mask was completely gone now, replaced by something more genuine and, surprisingly, more beautiful. But you're 26. You have time to figure it out, to build connections, to find someone. When you're 52 and divorced, and you've spent 12 years hiding behind work because it's easier than risking getting hurt again. She trailed off, shaking, her head. I'm sorry. This is incredibly unfair to you. You're here to work, not to listen to your boss have a midlife crisis. Stop apologizing, I said, standing up from my chair. And stop calling it inappropriate. Maybe it is by some corporate handbook standard, but who cares? We're two people having a conversation. She looked at me with something like wonder, as if the idea that someone might actually want to listen to her personal struggles was foreign to her. Besides, I continued, the Brennan account can wait. This seems more important. That earned me a small smile, the kind that reached her eyes and made her look years younger. You're going to make some woman very happy someday, Marcus. You have a rare gift for making people feel heard. The comment hung between us, loaded with implications that neither of us seemed quite ready to address directly. Instead, Victoria returned to her desk and sat down, but this time she turned her chair to face me rather than her computer. Can I tell you something else? She asked. Of course. Tonight, when I asked you to stay late, it wasn't entirely about the Brennan account. I mean, the work needs to be done, but I could have handled it myself or pushed the deadline. I asked you to stay because… She hesitated, as if saying the words out loud would make them too real. Because I didn't want to go home to an empty apartment again. Because I thought maybe, if you were here, I could pretend for a few hours that I wasn't completely alone in the world. The admission was so honest, so raw that I felt something shift in my chest. This wasn't just my boss confessing to loneliness. This was a woman who had reached a breaking point and had chosen to trust me with her vulnerability. Victoria, I said softly, you're not alone tonight. She looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something change in her face. Not romantic interest, It was too complex for that. But a kind of recognition, as if she was seeing me as more than just her employee for the first time. "No," she said quietly. "I suppose I'm not." The conversation might have continued, but it was interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Both of us tensed, instantly aware of how this might look to an outsider, the boss and her young employee having an intimate conversation in an empty office at nearly 11 p.m. The footsteps passed by without stopping, probably just the night security guard making his rounds, but the moment of panic had broken the spell of our conversation. Victoria straightened in her chair, and I could see her rebuilding her professional composure in real time. "We should probably get back to work," she said, though her tone suggested she didn't really want to. "Yeah, probably." But neither of us moved toward our computers. Instead, we sat in the soft light of her office, both of us processing what had just happened between us. "Marcus," Victoria said finally, "I need you to know that nothing about tonight changes anything at work. I'm still your boss, you're still my employee, and I expect the same level of professionalism from both of us tomorrow." I nodded, understanding the necessity of the boundary she was drawing, even as I felt disappointed by it. "But," she continued, "I also need you to know that I'm grateful for listening, for not making me feel ridiculous, for treating me like a person instead of just your supervisor. That means more to me than you probably realize." We returned to our respective desks and spent the next 2 hours working through the Brennan materials in relative silence. But the silence was different now. Not the uncomfortable quiet of strangers forced to work together, but the companionable quiet of two people who had shared something real and were comfortable existing in the same space. Around 1 a.m., Victoria announced that we'd done enough for one night. The bulk of the review was complete, and we could tackle the actual revisions fresh in the morning. As we packed up our things, I found myself reluctant to leave. Not because I wanted to extend the intimate conversation we'd had, but because I didn't want Victoria to go home to the empty apartment she'd described. "Victoria," I said as she was gathering her files, "would you like to grab a late dinner? I know a place that's open 24 hours. Nothing fancy, just—" I trailed off, realizing how the invitation might sound. But Victoria didn't look offended or uncomfortable. Instead, she looked touched. "That's very sweet of you to offer, but I think it's better if we call it a night. This has been—" She paused, searching for the right word. "This has been a lot. I need some time to process it." I nodded, understanding but still disappointed. As we waited for the elevator together, Victoria turned to me one more time. "Marcus, thank you. For tonight. For listening. For being kind. I know this situation is complicated, and I know I've put you in an awkward position. But I want you to know that I don't regret telling you those things. It felt good to be honest with someone for once." The elevator arrived, and we rode down to the lobby in silence. Outside, Victoria's car service was waiting, a luxury I envied but understood was necessary for someone in her position. "I'll see you tomorrow," she said as she got into the car. "See you tomorrow." I watched her car pull away into the late-night traffic, then began my own journey home on the subway. As the train carried me through the tunnels beneath the city, I replayed the entire evening in my mind. The work crisis that had started it all seemed almost insignificant compared to what had emerged from those hours alone together. Victoria Chen, the untouchable executive I'd been intimidated by for 8 months, had revealed herself to be achingly human. Her confession of loneliness resonated with something deep in my own experience, and her trust in sharing it with me felt like a responsibility I wasn't sure I was equipped to handle. But there was something else. Something I was hesitant to acknowledge even to myself. The woman I'd seen tonight, vulnerable, honest, searching, was someone I found myself genuinely caring about. Not as an employee concerned for his boss, but as one person who recognized something familiar in another person's struggle. By the time I reached my apartment, it was nearly 2 a.m. I collapsed onto my bed, still fully dressed, and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow we would return to our professional roles, pretend that nothing had changed, and continue working together as if she hadn't confessed to bone-deep loneliness, and I hadn't wanted to do something about it. But as I drifted off to sleep, I knew that something fundamental had shifted between us. Victoria had trusted me with her truth, and that trust felt like a fragile, precious thing that would change everything about how we related to each other going forward. The question was, what were we supposed to do with that trust? And how long could we pretend that nothing had changed when everything clearly had? I woke up the next morning with the disorienting feeling that something significant had happened, though it took a few moments for the memories of the previous night to fully surface. When they did, I felt a mixture of anticipation and dread about facing Victoria at work. How do you interact normally with someone who has just revealed their deepest vulnerabilities to you? The subway ride to the office felt longer than usual, giving me too much time to overthink every possible scenario. Would Victoria pretend nothing had happened? Would she be embarrassed, angry at herself for opening up? Would she maintain the professional distance she'd insisted upon? Or would there be some acknowledgement of what had passed between us? I arrived at the office 15 minutes early, hoping to settle into my routine before Victoria arrived. But as I approached my cubicle, I could already hear the familiar sound of her heels clicking against the floor. She was at her desk, perfectly composed as always, her hair in its usual immaculate bun, wearing a charcoal gray suit that looked like it cost more than my monthly rent. "Good morning, Marcus," she said as I passed her office, her tone crisp and professional. Not cold exactly, but certainly not warm. It was as if she had rebuilt her walls overnight, brick by brick. "Morning," I replied, trying to match her tone, while studying her face for any sign of the vulnerable woman I'd seen the night before. There was nothing. Victoria Chen, Senior Marketing Director, was back in full force. I settled at my desk and pulled up the Brennan account files, determined to throw myself into the work and not analyze every interaction. But concentration proved elusive. Every time Victoria walked past my cubicle, every time she spoke to someone else in the office, I found myself hyper-aware of her presence. Around 10 a.m., she appeared at my desk with a stack of folders. "I need you to coordinate with the design team on the new Brennan materials," she said, all business. "The client wants to see initial concepts by Tuesday, which gives us exactly 4 days to completely reimagine their brand identity." 4 days? I looked up at her, searching for some hint of the person who had confided in me just hours earlier. That's not much time for a complete rebrand. No, it's not. But that's what they're paying us for. Her tone was matter-of-fact, but I caught something in her eyes. A flicker of the frustration she'd expressed the night before about impossible clients and unrealistic demands. "I'll get right on it," I said. She nodded and turned to leave. Then, paused. "Marcus? Yes? Thank you for staying late last night. Your dedication to the project is appreciated." The words were professional, appropriate for anyone who might overhear. But there was something in the way she said appreciated that felt personal, like a coded message acknowledging what had really happened between us. The morning progressed, with a series of meetings about various accounts. I found myself watching Victoria during these sessions, noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. The way she straightened her shoulders when James Henderson questioned her recommendations. The slight tension in her jaw when clients made unreasonable demands. The professional smile that never quite reached her eyes. It was as if her confession the night before had given me a new lens through which to see her. Where I'd once seen only competence and control, I now noticed the effort it took to maintain that facade. The loneliness she'd described wasn't just something that happened to her at home. It was something she carried with her everywhere, hidden beneath layers of professional armor. During lunch, I decided to test the waters. I approached her office with a question about the Brennan timeline that could have been handled over email. "Do you have a minute?" I asked, standing in her doorway. "Of course. What do you need?" I stepped into her office and closed the door behind me, a liberty I'd never taken before. Victoria raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. "I wanted to ask about the budget allocation for the design work, but..." I paused, gathering courage. "I also wanted to check if you're okay. After last night." Victoria's professional mask slipped, for just a moment, revealing something raw and uncertain underneath. Then she reconstructed it with visible effort. "I'm fine, Marcus. Last night I was tired. I may have shared more than was appropriate, but it doesn't change anything about our working relationship. I didn't think it did. I just wanted you to know that if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here." She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her wrestling with something internal. "That's very kind of you," she said finally. "But I think it's better if we maintain professional boundaries going forward." I nodded, though I felt disappointed. "Of course. I understand." But as I turned to leave, she spoke again, her voice softer. "Marcus, I meant what I said last night. About being grateful. That part wasn't just exhaustion talking. The rest of the day passed in a strange tension. We worked together efficiently on the Brennan project, but there was an undercurrent of awareness between us that made every interaction feel charged with unspoken meaning. Other colleagues seemed to notice something different, though they couldn't put their finger on what it was. "You and Victoria seem to be working closely on this Brennan thing," said Jennifer from accounting during a coffee break. "She's been asking for you specifically on a lot of projects lately." "Just the nature of the work," I replied. But Jennifer's observation made me realize that Victoria had indeed been involving me in more high-level projects over the past few weeks. Had I not noticed, or had something been building between us, even before last night's confession? Around 4 p.m., James Henderson called an impromptu meeting about the Brennan account. As we gathered in the conference room, I could see Victoria's tension increase. Henderson had a way of undermining her authority in front of clients and colleagues, and these meetings often turned into exercises in public humiliation disguised as collaborative feedback. "So, Victoria," Henderson began, settling his considerable bulk into the chair at the head of the table, "I've been thinking about this Brennan rebrand situation. I'm not sure we're approaching it correctly." Victoria's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "What concerns do you have about our approach?" "Well, for starters, I think we're overcomplicating things. The client wants fresh and modern, right? So why don't we just give them something trendy and call it a day?" "Because," Victoria replied carefully, "a successful rebrand needs to be strategic, not just trendy. We need to consider their target demographic, their market position, their long-term brand goals." Sure, Henderson waved her off dismissively. "But at the end of the day, they're paying us to make them look good. Sometimes you academic types overthink these things." I felt anger flare in my chest at the condescending way he dismissed her expertise. Victoria's face remained composed, but I could see the muscle in her jaw working. "I understand your perspective," she said evenly, "but I believe a strategic approach will serve the client better in the long run." "Maybe. But I think we should consider bringing in some outside consultants. Fresh eyes, you know? Sometimes when you've been doing things the same way for too long, you lose perspective." The insult was subtle but clear. Victoria was stale, outdated, losing her edge. Around the table, other colleagues shifted uncomfortably, aware they were witnessing something ugly but powerless to intervene. "I'm confident in our team's ability to deliver excellent work," Victoria replied, her voice steady, despite what I now recognized as barely controlled frustration. "I'm sure you are. But confidence and results are two different things, aren't they?" That was the moment I surprised myself by speaking up. "Actually, Mr. Henderson, I think Victoria's strategic approach is exactly what this client needs. The restaurant industry is incredibly competitive right now, and brands that just chase trends without understanding their core identity usually fail within 5 years." The conference room went silent. Henderson turned his attention to me, his expression shifting from dismissive to genuinely surprised that someone so junior would challenge him. "That's an interesting perspective, Marcus. Where did you get that information?" I felt Victoria's eyes on me, but I pressed forward. "I've been researching restaurant industry trends as part of the Brennan project. The most successful rebrands in the past decade have been strategic overhauls, not surface-level design changes. Victoria's approach aligns with the data." Henderson's face darkened slightly. He wasn't used to being contradicted, especially not by someone at my level. "Well," he said finally, "I appreciate your enthusiasm, but I think those of us with more experience should probably make these decisions." "Of course," I replied, but I didn't back down from his stare. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, but the dynamic had shifted. Henderson was more subdued in his criticism of Victoria's approach, and several other colleagues voiced support for the strategic direction. When we finally dispersed, Victoria caught my eye and gave me the slightest nod of acknowledgement. An hour later, she appeared at my desk. "I need to see you in my office," she said, her expression unreadable. I followed her, wondering if I was about to be reprimanded for overstepping boundaries. She closed the door behind us and turned to face me. "That was incredibly stupid," she said. "I'm sorry, and incredibly brave." Her stern expression softened into something approaching gratitude. "You didn't have to do that. Speaking up to Henderson could hurt your career here." "Maybe. But watching him dismiss your expertise like that..." I shook my head. It wasn't right. Victoria walked to her window, looking out at the afternoon traffic, up below. "Do you know how long it's been since someone has defended me in a meeting like that? I can't imagine it's been that long." "Try never." She turned back to me. "In 15 years of corporate life, no one has ever put their own position at risk to support me, not even my ex-husband." The admission hung between us, another small crack in the professional wall she was trying to maintain. "I don't think I put my position at risk," I said. "I just stated facts. Marcus." She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You're either very naive about office politics, or you're the most decent person I've ever worked with. Maybe both?" That earned me a genuine smile, the kind I'd seen briefly the night before. "Thank you," she said simply, "for standing up for me, for treating me like I have something valuable to contribute, for..." She paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "For seeing me." The last phrase was so quiet I almost missed it, but when I caught it, I felt something shift in my chest. This wasn't just gratitude for professional support. This was something deeper, more personal. "Victoria," I said carefully, "I want you to know that last night, when you said you were tired of being alone, don't." She held up her hand, but not harshly. "Please don't. We can't go down that road." "Why not?" "Because you're 26 and I'm 52. Because I'm your boss. Because it would be complicated and messy and probably destructive for both of us. And because you're scared," I added gently. She stared at me for a long moment, and I saw her consider denying it. Then her shoulders sagged slightly. "Yes," she admitted, "because I'm terrified." The honesty in her admission made something inside. Miach. Here was this brilliant, accomplished woman, afraid to take a chance on connection because she'd been hurt before. "I'm scared too," I said. "But I'm more scared of pretending that nothing is happening between us." Victoria closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "Marcus, even if there is something happening between us, and I'm not saying there is, it can't go anywhere. The complications alone would be..." "What if we didn't worry about complications for a minute?" I interrupted. "What if we just acknowledge that we care about each other, and see where that leads?" She opened her eyes and looked at me with something that might have been longing. "I can't," she whispered. "I won't survive another failure, and you deserve someone who isn't carrying around this much baggage." "What if that's not your decision to make?" The question hung in the air between us. Victoria looked like she was wrestling with something enormous, caught between the fear that had kept her safe for 12 years and the possibility of something real with someone who saw her clearly. Before she could answer, there was a knock on her office door. We sprang apart, though we hadn't been standing particularly close, both of us suddenly aware of how intense the conversation had become. "Come in," Victoria called, her professional mask snapping back into place. It was Jennifer from accounting with a question about budget allocations. As Victoria handled the inquiry with her usual competence, I stood there processing what had just happened between us. We'd crossed another line, acknowledged feelings that neither of us was quite ready to act on. When Jennifer left, Victoria turned back to me, but the moment had passed. The walls were back up, the professional distance restored. "We should get back to work," she said. "The Brennan materials won't finish themselves." I nodded and turned to leave, but at the door, I paused. "Victoria, for what it's worth, I don't think you're carrying baggage. I think you're carrying experience, and I think you're worth the complications." I left before she could respond, but as I walked back to my desk, I could feel her eyes on me. The game between us had changed again, and neither of us was quite sure what the new rules were. 3 days passed after our charged conversation in Victoria's office, and the tension between us had become almost unbearable. We maintained our professional facade during the day. But there were moments, a lingering glance across the conference room, the way her fingers brushed mine when she handed me files, the careful distance she maintained when we worked side by side, that made it clear we were both struggling with the unspoken connection growing between us. The Brennan project had become a pressure cooker of impossible deadlines and conflicting demands. The CEO's daughter had rejected our first round of concepts, demanding something more authentic and grassroots, while simultaneously wanting it to look premium and sophisticated. Victoria had handled each revision request with her usual professionalism, but I could see the stress wearing on her. She was staying later each night, arriving earlier each morning, and I noticed she'd started drinking more coffee and eating less. Friday afternoon brought another crisis. Henderson burst into the office at 3 p.m., his face red with the kind of panic that usually preceded someone getting fired. "Victoria!" he bellowed across the office floor, causing half the staff to look up from their computers. "Conference room, now. And bring Thompson." Victoria's jaw tightened, but she gathered her materials without comment. I followed her into the conference room, where Henderson was pacing like a caged animal while frantically typing on his phone. "Brennan just called," he announced without preamble. "They hate everything. The concepts, the messaging, the timeline, everything. They're threatening to pull the account unless we can present something completely different by Monday morning." I felt my stomach drop. The Brennan account represented nearly a third of our revenue. Losing it would mean layoffs, possibly including me. "What specifically are they objecting to?" Victoria asked, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the crisis. "Everything!" Henderson threw his hands up. "They said our work looks corporate and soulless, and that we clearly don't understand their brand vision." Victoria's face remained impassive, but I could see her thinking, processing the impossible situation we'd been handed. "Mr. Henderson," she said carefully, "we've been following the brand guidelines they provided. If they want something completely different, we'll need more specific direction about what—" "I don't want to hear about guidelines," Henderson snapped. "I want solutions. This company can't afford to lose this account, which means you can't afford to lose this account." The threat was barely veiled. Victoria's job was on the line, and by extension, so was mine. "I understand the urgency," Victoria replied evenly. "Give us the weekend. We'll develop new concepts and have something fresh for them Monday morning." Henderson studied her face for a moment, as if trying to determine whether she was capable of pulling off a miracle. "Fine. But Victoria, I'm serious about this. If we lose Brennan, there are going to be consequences. Major ones." After he left, Victoria and I sat in the empty conference room, both of us processing what had just happened. "This is insane," I said. "They want us to completely reimagine a brand in 3 days?" "Welcome to client services," Victoria replied, but there was no humor in her voice. "The client is always right, even when they're completely wrong." I studied her profile as she stared at the conference table. There was something different about her posture, a kind of resignation I hadn't seen before. "Victoria, are you okay?" She was quiet for a long moment, then looked at me with eyes that seemed older than they had just a week ago. "Marcus, I need to tell you something. Henderson has been looking for a reason to get rid of me for months. My salary is too high. I'm not a cultural fit. I ask too many questions about his decisions. If we lose this account, I'm done here." The admission hit me like a punch to the chest. "That's not going to happen. We'll figure this out." "Will we?" She laughed, but it was hollow. "We have 3 days to create something that will save both our jobs. The client has rejected everything we've shown them. We have no clear direction about what they actually want, and Henderson is looking for any excuse to blame me when this goes wrong." I'd never seen Victoria this defeated, and it scared me more than the threat to our jobs. This was the woman who had built a career on solving impossible problems, and she was talking like she'd already given up. "Then we work the weekend," I said. "Both of us. We lock ourselves in here and we don't leave until we have something brilliant." Victoria looked at me with something that might have been gratitude, but also skepticism. "Marcus, you don't understand. This isn't just about working harder. The client doesn't know what they want, which means we're essentially throwing darts at a wall and hoping something sticks. And even if we create something perfect, Henderson will find a way to blame me if anything goes wrong. So what are you saying? That we should just give up?" I'm saying that maybe it's time for me to face reality. I'm 52 years old. I've been hiding in this job for 12 years, and maybe losing it would force me to finally figure out what I actually want to do with the rest of my life. The resignation in her voice was heartbreaking, but it also sparked something angry in me. That's bullshit, I said, more forcefully than I'd ever spoken to her before. Victoria's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Excuse me? I said that's bullshit. You're one of the most brilliant people I've ever met. You've saved this company millions of dollars with your strategic thinking. You've turned around accounts that other agencies couldn't handle. And you've done it all while dealing with a boss who doesn't appreciate you and clients who don't deserve you. I stood up from the conference table, suddenly unable to sit still. And you know what else? Henderson isn't looking to fire you because you're not good at your job. He's looking to fire you because you are good at your job. And that threatens him. You make him look incompetent by comparison, which he is. Victoria stared at me, and I couldn't tell if she was angry or shocked by my outburst. But most importantly, I continued, giving up now means letting them win. It means letting Henderson push out the best strategist this company has because he's intimidated by your competence. And I'll be damned if I'm going to stand by and watch that happen. The silence stretched between us for what felt like hours. Victoria's face cycled through several emotions: surprise, consideration, and something that might have been hope. You really believe that? She asked quietly. Every word. She stood up and walked to the conference room window, looking out at the late afternoon traffic. You know what the worst part is? She said without turning around. I used to believe it too. I used to know my worth, used to fight for my ideas, used to demand the respect I deserved. But 12 years of being undermined and overlooked and passed over for promotions, it wears you down. It makes you start to believe that maybe they're right. Maybe you're not as good as you thought you were. I walked over to stand beside her at the window. They're not right. And you are that good. She turned to look at me, and the vulnerability in her eyes made my chest ache. How can you be so sure? Because I've been watching you work for 8 months. I've seen you solve problems that would stump people with twice your budget and half your constraints. I've seen you turn Henderson's terrible ideas into workable campaigns without making him look like an idiot. I've seen you care about quality and strategy when everyone else just wants to take the easy way out. Victoria's eyes were bright with unshed tears, and I realized this might be the first time in years that someone had truly seen and appreciated her professional abilities. And because, I added, stepping closer to her, I've seen the person you are when you let your guard down. You're not just brilliant at your job, Victoria. You're kind, funny, and incredibly strong. You're someone worth fighting for. The last sentence hung in the air between us, loaded with meaning that went far beyond the professional crisis we were facing. Marcus, she whispered, we can't. Can't what? Can't acknowledge that we care about each other? Can't admit that something real is happening between us? Can't fight together instead of struggling alone? I was standing close enough to see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes, close enough to smell her perfume, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her skin. I'm scared, she admitted, so quietly I almost missed it. Of what? Of everything. Of losing my job, of being alone, of taking a chance on something that could destroy both our careers, of being hurt again, of hurting you. I reached out and gently touched her hand, and she didn't pull away. What if we take those risks together? Victoria looked down at our joined hands, then back up at my face. For a moment, I thought she might say yes, might finally let herself take a chance on whatever was building between us. Instead, she stepped back, breaking the contact. We should focus on saving our jobs first, she said, her professional mask sliding back into place. We can deal with everything else later. I felt disappointed but not surprised. Victoria had spent 12 years protecting herself, and that kind of caution didn't disappear overnight. Okay, I said. So what's our strategy for the weekend? For the next hour, we brainstormed approaches to the Brennan crisis. Victoria's strategic mind was in full force, analyzing the client's complaints and developing theories about what they might actually want versus what they were saying they wanted. The problem is authenticity, she concluded finally. They keep using that word, but they don't know what it means in the context of their brand. They think authentic means rustic and handmade, but their restaurants are in shopping malls and airports. So how do we give them authenticity that actually fits their business model? Victoria was quiet for a moment, and I could practically see her brain working. We don't give them what they think they want, she said slowly. We give them what they actually need. We create something that honors their heritage as a family business, while acknowledging what they've become, a successful regional chain that brings comfort food to busy people. It was a brilliant insight, the kind of strategic thinking that separated Victoria from every other marketing director I'd ever encountered. That could work, I said. But how do we sell it to them? We don't sell it. We show it. We create materials so compelling that they can't imagine anything else. Victoria looked at me with something approaching excitement, the first positive emotion I'd seen from her all week. Marcus, are you free this weekend? Completely. Good. Because we're going to work through this together. And by Monday morning, we're going to have something so good that Henderson won't be able to find fault with it. As we gathered our materials to head home for the evening, I felt a surge of something that was part professional pride and part personal affection. Victoria had chosen to trust me with this crisis, to work with me as a partner rather than just an employee. Victoria, I said as we waited for the elevator. Yes? We're going to be okay, both of us. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, then reached out and squeezed my hand briefly. Thank you, Marcus, for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself. The elevator arrived, and as we rode down together, I realized that our weekend working together would either save our professional relationship or completely transform our personal one. Possibly both. Either way, I was ready for whatever came next. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that made staying inside feel like destiny rather than choice. I arrived at the office at 8 a.m. to find Victoria already. There, surrounded by coffee cups, design printouts, and what looked like the contents of every marketing textbook ever written. She'd changed out of her usual business attire into dark jeans and a cream-colored sweater that made her look younger, more approachable, somehow more real. How long have you been here? I asked, setting down my own coffee and the bag of bagels I'd picked up on the way. Since 6. I couldn't sleep, so I figured I might as well be productive. She gestured at the chaos around her desk. I've been going through every successful restaurant rebrand from the past decade, looking for patterns, insights, anything that might help us crack this. I surveyed the materials she'd assembled. Market research reports, competitor analyses, consumer behavior, studies, brand case studies. It was the kind of comprehensive preparation that would normally take a team weeks to compile. Victoria, this is incredible. You've basically built a masterclass in restaurant branding overnight. She looked up from the report she was reading, and I was struck by how different she seemed in this casual setting. Without the armor of her business suits and the formality of regular office hours, she looked more like someone I might meet at a coffee shop or bookstore. Approachable, intellectual, beautiful, in a way that had nothing to do with professional competence. I may have gotten a little carried away, she admitted with a self-conscious smile. But I think I'm onto something. Look at this. She spread out several campaigns on the conference table we'd commandeered for our war room. Each one showed a different approach to the authenticity problem we were facing. Here's what I've figured out, she said, falling into the kind of animated explanation that showed her passion for the work. Authenticity in restaurant branding isn't about looking handmade or rustic. It's about being honest about your value proposition. The most successful rebrands acknowledge what the business actually is, then find ways to make that feel special and intentional. I leaned over the table to study the examples she'd highlighted, acutely aware of her proximity. She smelled like coffee and something floral, her perfume probably, though it was subtler than what she wore during the week. So for Brennan, I said, forcing myself to focus on the work, instead of pretending they're a farm-to-table artisanal experience, we embrace the fact that they're a reliable, accessible comfort food destination. Exactly. But we make that feel like a deliberate choice, a philosophy about food being a source of comfort and connection rather than pretension. Victoria's eyes were bright with excitement, and I realized this was what she looked like when she was truly engaged with a creative challenge. It was captivating. That's brilliant, I said. How do we execute it? For the next 3 hours, we worked with an intensity and collaboration I'd never experienced before. Victoria's strategic insights combined with my fresh perspective and willingness to take creative risks. We weren't boss and employee anymore. We were partners working toward a shared goal. By noon, we had the foundation of a campaign that felt genuinely revolutionary. Instead of chasing trends or trying to be something they weren't, we were going to help Brennan own their identity as the place where real people ate real food without apology. "I'm starving," Victoria announced as we stepped back to survey our work. "And I think we've earned a break." "There's a great deli about 2 blocks from here," I suggested. "We could grab something and eat in the park across the street." Victoria hesitated for a moment, and I could see her weighing the professional implications of having lunch together on a weekend. Then something shifted in her expression. "That sounds perfect." 20 minutes later, we were sitting on a bench in the small park, sharing sandwiches and watching families enjoy their Saturday afternoon. It was surreal, seeing Victoria in this normal, everyday setting. She looked so different from the intimidating executive I'd known for 8 months. "I ask you something personal?" I said, then immediately felt stupid for asking permission. We were way past formal boundaries at this point. "Sure. What did you want to be when you were my age?" Victoria took a bite of her sandwich, considering the question. "A writer, actually. I had this romantic notion about working for a magazine, traveling the world, documenting interesting stories and fascinating people. What happened? Reality, mostly. I graduated college with an English degree just as the magazine industry was collapsing. The only jobs available were in marketing. So I took one temporarily while I figured out my next move. Temporary became permanent, and before I knew it, I was climbing the corporate ladder because I was good at it, not because it was what I wanted." She paused, watching a young couple push their toddler on the swings nearby. "I used to write, though, in my spare time. I had a blog about city life, observations about people and places. Nothing groundbreaking, but it felt authentic to who I was." "Do you still write?" "No. I stopped after my divorce. I guess I lost confidence in my voice, in whether anything I had to say was worth reading." The sadness in her admission made my chest ache. Here was this brilliant woman who had been slowly convinced to diminish herself, to hide her talents, to settle for professional success that felt hollow. "I'd love to read some of your old writings sometime," I said. Victoria looked at me with surprise. "Really?" "Really. I bet you were amazing at it." She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer. "You know what's strange? I haven't talked about my writing in years. Even my ex-husband thought it was a silly hobby. But sitting here with you, talking about it, it doesn't feel silly. It feels like remembering who I used to be." Something about the way she said it, wistful but not bitter, made me want to help her remember more than just who she used to be. I wanted to help her discover who she could still become. "Maybe it's not too late to be that person again?" I suggested gently. Victoria looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Marcus, can I tell you something?" "Of course." "This morning, working with you, collaborating on this campaign, it's the most energized I've felt about work in years, maybe ever. Not because of the project, but because of the partnership. Because someone was treating my ideas like they mattered, building on them instead of tearing them down." The honesty in her confession made my heart race. "Your ideas do matter. You matter." She held my gaze for a long moment, and I could see her wrestling with something internal. "I know we said we'd focus on work first," she said carefully, "but I need you to know that this," she gestured between us, "isn't just professional for me anymore. I don't know what it is exactly, but it's not just work." The admission hung in the air between us like a bridge neither of us was sure we should cross. "It's not just professional for me either," I replied, my voice rougher than I intended. Victoria closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "This is terrifying," she whispered. "What is feeling something real for someone who actually sees me, who makes me remember who I am underneath all the professional armor, who makes me want to take risks I haven't been brave enough to take in 12 years. I reached out and took her hand, and this time, she didn't pull away. "Victoria, don't," she said quickly but not harshly. "Don't say anything yet. Let me just sit with this feeling for a minute without analyzing it or worrying about the consequences. We sat in silence, hands joined, watching the world go by around us. It was one of those perfect moments that felt both significant and ordinary, the kind of memory that becomes a touchstone for everything that comes after. Finally, Victoria squeezed my hand and stood up. "We should get back," she said. "We still have a campaign to finish." The afternoon flew by in a blur of creative energy. We refined our concept, developed messaging frameworks, and outlined presentation materials. But underneath the professional focus, there was a new intimacy between us. Casual touches when we reached for the same file, moments when our eyes met and held longer than necessary, an awareness of each other that made even routine interactions feel charged with meaning. Around 6 p.m., Victoria stretched and announced that she needed a proper dinner break. "There's a little Italian place around the corner," she said. "Nothing fancy, but they make amazing pasta. Want to grab something there?" The restaurant was small and dimly lit, the kind of neighborhood place where locals came for comfort food and conversation. We found a corner table and ordered wine with our dinner, a small transgression that felt significant given our usual professional boundaries. "I have a confession," Victoria said after our food arrived. "I've been thinking about asking you to dinner for weeks, not for work, just dinner." "Why didn't you?" "Because I'm your boss. Because you're 26 and I'm 52. Because it would be complicated, and potentially destructive and probably a terrible idea." "And now?" Victoria took a sip of wine and considered the question. "Now I'm tired of letting fear make my decisions for me. I'm tired of being alone because it's safer than being vulnerable. I'm tired of pretending that what I feel for you is just professional respect." My heart was hammering so hard I was sure she could hear it. "What do you feel for me?" Victoria set down her wine glass and looked directly into my eyes. "I feel like you see me clearly. Not just the successful executive or the lonely divorcee, but the whole person. I feel challenged and supported and appreciated in ways I'd forgotten were possible. I feel alive when I'm with you. More myself than I've been in years." The honesty in her words took my breath away. "I feel the same way," I said. "You make me want to be better, braver, more thoughtful. You make me excited about work, about life, about possibilities I hadn't even considered before." Victoria reached across the table and took my hand. "This is crazy," she said softly. "We work together. There could be consequences we haven't thought through. People will talk, make assumptions, judge us both. I know. And we're at very different places in our lives. You're just starting your career, figuring out who you want to become. I'm settled in ways that might feel limiting to someone your age. I know that too. And there's no guarantee this would work. We could try and fail spectacularly and make everything awkward and complicated." "Victoria," I said gently, "are you trying to talk yourself out of this?" She laughed, a sound that was part nervous and part relieved. "Yes. Absolutely. I'm terrified of wanting something this much." "What if we start small?" I suggested. "What if we just admit that we care about each other and see what happens? No pressure, no expectations, just honesty." Victoria studied my face for a long moment, as if she was memorizing it. "I care about you, Marcus. More than I should. More than is probably wise, but completely honestly. I care about you too, and I think what we have is worth exploring, regardless of the complications." Victoria squeezed my hand, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked completely unguarded. "Okay," she said simply. "Let's see what happens." We finished dinner in a bubble of quiet intimacy, talking about everything except work. Victoria told me about her childhood in California, her dreams of travel, her complicated relationship with her sister. I shared stories about growing up in the suburbs, my college years, my uncertainty about the future. When we finally returned to the office to collect our things, the building felt different, charged with possibility and the echo of confessions that had changed everything between us. "Same time tomorrow?" Victoria asked as we waited for the elevator. "Wouldn't miss it." As the elevator arrived, Victoria turned to me with a smile that was both shy and radiant. "Marcus, thank you for today, for work, for conversation, for everything. Thank you for trusting me with it all." The elevator doors closed, separating us for the night. But as I walked to the subway, I felt like everything in my life had shifted. Victoria Chen was no longer just my intimidating boss. She was a woman I cared about deeply, someone who had chosen to be vulnerable with me, someone who might, just might, be the beginning of something extraordinary. Monday morning arrived with the weight of everything hanging in the balance. Victoria and I had spent Sunday perfecting our presentation, but more importantly, we'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. We were no longer just colleagues. We were two people who had admitted to caring deeply for each other, standing on the precipice of either professional triumph or complete disaster. The Brennan presentation was scheduled for 10 a.m. At 9:45, Victoria and I stood outside the conference room, our materials perfectly organized, our strategy refined to perfection. But the real test wasn't whether our campaign would succeed. It was whether we could navigate this new reality between us. "Ready?" Victoria asked, her professional mask firmly in place, though I could see the nervousness in her eyes. "Ready?" The presentation went flawlessly. Our authenticity strategy resonated immediately with the Brennan team. Instead of trying to be something they weren't, we'd help them embrace their identity as the reliable comfort food destination for real families. The CEO's daughter, who had been the source of so much chaos, actually teared up during our emotional messaging segment about food bringing people together. Henderson sat in stunned silence as the Brennan team praised our work, called it exactly what we needed, and signed off on the entire campaign without a single revision request. After they left, Henderson turned to Victoria with something approaching respect. "That was exceptional work, both of you." It was the closest thing to an apology we were likely to get from him. Over the following weeks, Victoria and I developed a careful rhythm. At work, we maintained our professional relationship, though there was an undercurrent of awareness between us that made even routine interactions feel significant. After hours, we began exploring what we meant to each other. Our first official date was dinner at a small French restaurant, where Victoria felt safe from colleagues who might recognize us. She wore a blue dress that brought out her eyes, and I realized I was falling for her in ways that had nothing to do with our workplace dynamic. "I've been thinking," she said over dessert, "about what you said about it not being too late to be who I used to be." And I started writing again, just small pieces. Observations about the city, about work, about— She smiled shyly. About falling for someone unexpected. The relationship unfolded gradually, carefully. Victoria's fears about our age difference and professional complications proved largely unfounded. We discovered we shared similar values, complementary strengths, and a deep intellectual connection that made every conversation feel meaningful. 3 months later, Victoria made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She resigned from Henderson and Associates to start her own consultancy. The success of the Brennan campaign had brought her several offers from other agencies, but she chose independence instead. "I realized," she told me on her last day, "that I'd been settling for comfortable instead of pursuing what I actually wanted. You helped me remember that I'm capable of more than just surviving." I left Henderson and Associates 2 weeks later to join her new venture as her first employee and creative partner. We rented a small office space in downtown Manhattan, just the two of us, and a dream of building something meaningful together. A year later, Victoria Chen Creative had a roster of clients who valued strategic thinking over corporate politics. Victoria had found her voice again, both professionally and personally. She published a blog about entrepreneurship after 50 that gained a devoted following. She was featured in marketing magazines as an example of successful career reinvention. But the real transformation was personal. The guarded, lonely woman I'd met that first night working late had blossomed into someone confident, open, and deeply happy. We traveled together, worked together, built a life together that honored both our professional ambitions and our personal connection. "You know what I realized?" Victoria said one evening as we walked through Central Park, a ritual we'd developed during our courtship. "What? That night when I asked you to work late and told you I was tired of being alone, I wasn't just talking about going home to an empty apartment. I was tired of being alone with my fears, my doubts, my belief that I wasn't worthy of something real." She stopped walking and turned to face me. "You didn't just help me save my job, Marcus. You helped me save myself." 2 years after that first late night in the office, I proposed to Victoria on the anniversary of the day she'd confessed her loneliness to me. We were back in that same office building, which now housed our thriving consultancy. "I have something to tell you," I said, echoing her words from that transformative night. "What's that?" "I'm 28 years old, and I'm tired of imagining my future without you in it." Victoria laughed through happy tears as I got down on one knee. Our wedding was small, intimate, attended by the clients who had become friends and the colleagues who had supported our unconventional love story. Victoria's sister flew in from California, amazed at the transformation in her once guarded sibling. "I've never seen you this happy," she told Victoria during the reception. "I never knew I could be this happy," Victoria replied, looking at me with eyes that held no traces of the loneliness that had once defined her. Standing there in my wedding tuxedo, watching my brilliant, beautiful wife dance with her sister, I thought about that night 2 years ago when everything had changed. Victoria had asked me to work late, shared her deepest vulnerability, and trusted me with her heart. In return, I'd shown her that being 52 and tired of being alone wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories start with the courage to admit you're ready for something more, and the luck to find someone willing to build that something with you. Victoria Chen was no longer alone, and neither was I. We'd found each other in the most unexpected place, at the most unlikely time, and created a love story that proved it's never too late to start over when you find the right person to start over with. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.